Veronica, Willeto, DeCrane, and Chef, who on Tana, the Schmidt, and the now Bush's Chief, Torich, and the Shanalet, got the Sunny, the Shichay. Ted Chiefs, the Todet, and Shadow, Billings, Montana, the Kirsten. Put Ego, the Nest, son, the Schmidt. So I just introduced myself in my own language. I'm Diné, I'm Navajo. I grew up in New Mexico and I moved to Montana about 12 years ago and have been living here in Montana since. I'm married. My husband is Samson DeCrane from the Pryor community, and we have 5 children, and I live in Billings. And I introduced myself in the traditional way that my tribe does it, and we share our clans. So every Diné person has 4 clans, and so I shared mine. I'm of the Minihogans clan and born for the Mexican clan, and my maternal grandparents are of the Bitterwater clan, and my paternal grandparents are of the Single clan. So that's how we introduce ourselves, and then we also share where we are from. So I am from Ojo Encino. It's a really small rural community on the Navajo reservation in the area on the eastern agency side of our nation that expands into New Mexico. It's the checkerboard area that people often refer to it as. But I come from a really small community called Ojo Encino, and in Navajo, the name for it is rough rocks in the water. So it just describes the place there in my community. And also traditionally, we normally introduce our parents and then our grandparents, but I didn't go into that much detail. If I was in front of my own, people from my own community, I would probably share that. And then we end by saying, this is how I am a Diné woman. So that's how I introduced myself. And I like to continue to do that because as we're going to talk about this topic of historical trauma, I'm not a fluent Diné speaker. That language of my people was lost in my generation. My parents are fluent speakers. A lot of my older siblings are, but those of us that are younger in my family were not able to carry that on to be fluent speakers. But whatever I do know, I try to use it, especially being far away from home. That's part of the healing from historical trauma, is reclaiming some of the things that our people have lost. And so even though I'm not in front of a Diné audience, I do try to introduce myself in that way and carry myself in a way that I was taught to. So I just want to say good afternoon to you guys. This is like the after lunch crowd, so I hope nobody falls asleep. And then the room is kind of a tight quarters, and it's probably going to get pretty warm in here, so hopefully this doesn't put you guys to sleep. But hopefully the content will be helpful to you. I want to begin by saying that I'm not a legal expert. I have not worked in the legal field. I actually have a background in education and youth development. And so before I came to the Trauma Center, I've been with the Trauma Center for about 4 years. That's what I was doing. I was working with tribal youth on the Crow Reservation, as well as other reservations in Montana, and working primarily around behavioral support in the school system, because of the fact that so many of our Indigenous students do end up getting discipline in schools, and the high rates of out-of-school suspension is pretty high in Montana and is not representative of the Native youth population. And so I really try to work in the area of behavioral supports to be able to help educators find better ways of supporting youth who may have some difficult behaviors within the school environment than suspension or expulsion. And so as we all know, the school to prison pipeline is something that we're probably all aware of. So I think that's not something that's new to all of you, but so that's my background. And so when I stand before you guys, knowing that I'm not a legal expert and you guys are in the legal field, I will tell you this, that what I'm going to share is what I've learned over the years, but it's also from a place of someone that has family members that have struggled with substance use and that have, as a result, been involved in the justice system because of that. So I'm the child of a parent who struggled with alcohol and the sister of siblings that struggled with alcohol, and because of that, my family members have spent time in prison. And so I come thinking about that because even though I'm not a legal expert, something that we try to be aware of in the trauma-informed care field is the importance of lived experience. So I personally have not used substances, and I purposely did not do that in my life because of just my experience of what I had in my family. And so I didn't drink or do drugs, but just being around that and the absence of family members and the chaos, living in that kind of environment, so that is something that I'm familiar with. And what I think is important with trauma-informed care, and we're going to speak specifically about one type of trauma today, but what I think is really important that really helped me as a family member was to be able to understand the behaviors and the substance use that was really rampant in my family and in my community, and to understand that and to have a better response than what I did have. Because especially when I was younger, I had a lot of anger, I had a lot of frustration, but through being in this field, it's really helped me come at it from a different approach. And so hopefully this information will be helpful to you as well. And feel free to ask questions throughout if you guys have any specific questions. How many of you guys have learned about historical trauma before? So it looks like most of you have. Because of that, I did put some information in here about what is historical trauma and intergenerational trauma. I'll probably go through that information quickly. So if you guys have anything that you want me to expand on, feel free to stop me and I will expand on it. But just knowing that the majority of you have had some type of content already on what is historical trauma, I want to get us to the historical trauma-informed care content much quicker. So I should say some things about the National Native Children's Trauma Center who I'm representing today. We have a partnership with the Tribal Youth Resource Center, and so that's who requested us to be here today. But we are based out of the University of Montana, the College of Education, and I think we've been around since 2003, and we did start out doing direct trauma training services and tribal schools at that time. But now we are a training and technical assistance center, and we work with tribes and any kind of tribal child serving agency across the country. So whether it's law enforcement or healthcare or education or child welfare, we kind of work with a broad array of professionals who serve tribal youth and also serve their families. So that's what brought me here today. I'm going to begin by asking this question: why do we need to talk about historical trauma? So in the way that I was brought up, you didn't talk about stuff like this. Especially the tribal teachings that I learned growing up, there was a lot of caution And some might call it like stigma, but there's a lot of caution around delving into really difficult conversations like this, with fear of like what it can do to people who really spend too much time thinking on it. And so there was a lot of teachings that we were given about some of the traumatic events that have happened to our people, our tribal nation, and really trying to caution us on spending too much time thinking about and grieving and really opening yourself up to that. And so there was this understanding that there should be balance in life. And so like whenever you do have these kinds of conversations, you should also try to balance it with more of a strength-based understanding. And so that's just kind of the Indigenous worldview of just having a balanced approach to these kinds of issues for the sake of protection of people who may be harmed by talking about this. So I want to caution you that if you feel uneasy about any of the conversation that we're having, especially as we mention specific examples of historical traumatic events for tribal peoples, and if it's really disturbing to you, I will not be offended if you step out. But I do, want to just, we try not to trigger anybody, or we try not to harm anyone but through our presentations. But we also don't always have control over how people respond to them. And so just kind of take care of yourself in that sense if you're feeling like this presentation is bringing up a lot of difficult feelings for you. But why are we talking about this, knowing that it's such a difficult thing to talk about, and most of the time we would rather not? Because we want to think about the positive stuff, the strength-based things. But one of the reasons that we talk about it is that we often say that historical trauma is at the root of a lot of issues that we see in our tribal communities today. That some of the issues that you guys deal with on a daily basis, historical trauma is actually something that has caused some of those social conditions, has caused some of the adverse environments in our communities. And so we think that instead of only thinking about some of these issues that are going on in our communities, let's try to get to the root of it. And let's try to understand why there is, from my experience, why there is such high substance dependence in my community, or why there is such high justice involvement in my community. So we want to be able to kind of have a better understanding in order to have better solutions. And then the other thing is really, we want to make sure that people understand that when we talk about trauma, any kind of trauma, but today we're talking about historical trauma, that it is possible to heal. It's not something that, that adversity is not destiny, so it's not something that, determines a person's future and nothing can ever be done about it, and it's just hopeless. There is opportunity for healing, and that's something that is important for us to remember when we're discussing this. And also, it asks a better question. So we'll get to that more, but we can get to some of those solutions that we're hoping to bring about in our communities by asking better questions. And so that's what we're going to touch on today. So I'll begin. How many of you guys know Maria Delacour's Braveheart? Okay, she's Lakota. She's a psychologist. She's actually, she leads another trauma center at the University of New Mexico right now. And her research was really groundbreaking in this field because it was really one of the first times that historical trauma was really talked about in the context of tribal peoples. Because before this, as Americans, we talked about it in terms of the Holocaust. And so there was a lot of research around historical trauma dealing with the Jewish people and what had happened to them during the Holocaust, and how research was showing that, yes, survivors of the Holocaust were experiencing all this psychological impact, these social impacts, all of these ways in which they were impacted, and that's to be expected because they survived traumatic events. But what they were finding in the research was that it was more than just those that who had survived those events and were there. Their descendants were also starting to show signs and symptoms of trauma, and that there's greater attention being made to how is historical traumatic events like the Holocaust, how does it impact future generations? And so Maria really helped us use that concept and really think about the experiences of tribal people. But there are some differences, because with tribal people, it wasn't just one event like the Holocaust, and it wasn't, we can probably, as historians, identify a starting point and an ending point of that period, but we know that that's over, right? But for tribal peoples, it's actually not the case. And we'll see as we talk about it more that these historical traumatic events were not one-time events. They actually happened over the course of 500 years, and they continue to happen. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. And we'll also talk about how historical trauma is experienced by tribal peoples as a political experience. And that has a lot to do with the federal Indian policies that really cause a lot of the traumatic events that tribal peoples experience. It's also talked about as a tribal community specific experience, because even though there's like over 570 federally recognized tribal nations, and even though we all collectively experience similar federal Indian policies, we also have specific events and specific ways in which it affected our communities. So for example, my tribe, we went through an experience called the Long Walk, where we were forcefully removed from our tribal homelands by the U.S. Army, and they forced us to an internment camp called Fort Sumner in southern New Mexico, and it was like over 300 miles that our people had to walk, and many of our people died. And then when we went back there, there was actually really horrible conditions. There was, they kind of withheld rations. We were dependent on the federal government to survive through these rations, and there's a lot of disease that was rampant. And there was an expectation that that was going to be our new place to live, and we had to fertilize, we had to try to live off of the land there, but there was really harsh conditions in that area, and it was very difficult for us to raise crops there. And so a lot of our people died during that. And then thankfully our leaders at the time really negotiated for our people to return to our homelands. And of course, a lot of people, people died on the way back under just the harsh conditions that they were forced to walk and not really getting good care. And then when we did get back, we came back to our homelands that were really reduced. The establishment of our reservation, which was really in reduced size compared to the land that we had been living on before then. So that's the experience of my people. But if you look into the clients that you're serving and their tribal backgrounds, and you look into specifically their tribal histories, you will find unique experiences. Not everybody experienced forced removal. Not everybody got to return back to their homelands. And so as you guys learn more about the tribal history of your clients, you'll find that all tribal nations had unique experiences, even though we shared a collective experience. So what about intergenerational trauma? So historical trauma is often used interchangeably with intergenerational trauma. And that makes sense because we're trying to understand how these significant historical events really began to have an impact on the descendants of survivors, and really trying to understand the continued and ongoing impacts that they have. So we know that it's not just collectively that we see some of those impacts being carried out, but it's being carried out through family lineages and what families have specifically experienced, and it's being carried out through individual people. And so we see how that is being passed on intergenerationally. But one of the reasons why researchers really kind of distinguish intergenerational trauma from historical trauma is merely for the fact that historical trauma is specifically about ethnocidal and genocidal intent. So all of the historical traumatic events that we're going to talk about today, it was really out of the intention that we were either going to get rid of Native people on this land, or we were going to get rid of the Indianness in them. And so that was that genocide and ethnocide, similar to what happened to the Jewish people. And there's other people in the United States that have gone through this as well. We can think about the Japanese internment camps and just other types of people, other groups of people that have gone through that kind of being targeted for their ethnicity and really the attempt to commit genocide on their people. So that's what makes it different, but besides that, there's really a lot of similarities. And you guys probably know this history better than I do. But this is just going back to the idea that historical trauma is a political experience. It's not just that, this horrible thing happened to tribal peoples. It's the fact that these were government-sanctioned things that happened. And so experiences of being removed from our homelands, experiences of being placed in internment camps, experiences of the criminalization of our spirituality, all of those things happened at the hands of the federal government and was enforced by state governments and local governments. It was all part of this legal system that really tried to figure out what are we going to do about the Indian problem? How are we going to fix it? And one of the major themes of the experiences that tribal peoples have faced is removal. And it really began with removing tribal peoples from the land, like I mentioned. And if you can actually think about the significance of that, like if you're moving an entire nation of people from their homelands, and that's actually the land where they established their economy, where they established their culture and their identity, and they had a deep relationship with the land. And so their knowledge of it is what kept their communities vibrant and healthy. They knew all the medicines, they got food from the land, so they were so knowledgeable. They had stories that were tied to different locations. They had places that they prayed at. And so removal from land was really traumatic for that reason. And then another way in which there was removal is removing children from their families. And that really began with the boarding schools, the federal Indian boarding schools that a lot of times forcefully remove children. But even if it wasn't by force, the families usually had no other choice because the rations were being limited and they were starving and they're worried about their children surviving, and so they had no choice but to send their kids to these schools. And so there's actually a picture of little children's handcuffs, and that's actually one that was used to take children to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania. But this is a quote from the general who was leading the first federal Indian boarding school, Carlisle Indian School, Industrial School, and a quote from him about just how the intention of these schools was really to force assimilation, to force tribal peoples to be assimilated into the mainstream society. And so anything that had anything to do with their cultural identity, these schools were meant to take that away from them, to remove them from that cultural identity. But another theme of removal in tribal history is around child welfare. So those of you who are familiar with child welfare might actually know more about this, but the Indian Child Welfare Act that was passed at the time that it was first enacted was the intention to really address the issue that at that time, I think it was 1970, 30% of tribal children were in the child welfare system. I mean, if you actually think about your community and where you live, and if 30% of the children in your community were gone, how would that affect you? Wouldn't that be traumatic? Not just for the individual families, but for their community, to see all their children being placed in the child welfare system and removed from their families. So we still have the disproportionate number of tribal children in the child welfare system. So one of the things we want to make sure to iterate to you guys is that historical trauma, the name itself can be, there can be a misunderstanding because of that word historical. And a lot of times that's kind of the response that we get when we talk about historical trauma is that, oh, that's something that happened a long time ago. That's something in our past. That is something that we should be over already. We should have already dealt with that. We should move on. And so we think that, that's something that happened a long time ago and that has no bearing on what's going on today. But hopefully you'll see that there is a connection to what we are seeing playing out today in our tribal communities and across the country. So it's not historical in that sense, but it's historical in that it started all those years ago, but it persists. It persists today. So the easiest way for people to really understand how it persists is really making some of these obvious connections, right? It makes sense that some of the breaking of treaties and some of the establishment of the reservations has led to poor economic conditions, has led to underfunding of service systems in Indian country, when our treaties were actually there to make sure that some of those services like education and healthcare, that they were actually going to be provided to tribal peoples in exchange for the land that they were forced to give up. That actually didn't happen because those treaties were not honored. And so we can see some of the direct linkages between historical events that have happened and what the conditions that they have caused for tribal people today. And we can also think about intergenerationally how, for example, if we take the boarding school experiences, Maria did a study where she spoke with survivors of boarding schools and talked about their challenges with parenting, and found that some of those boarding school survivors, because of the conditions that they were raised in boarding schools, because some of them entered those schools at age 3, and didn't leave until they were 18. And so if you can imagine, if you don't know the conditions of those schools, there is a lot of abuse, physical, sexual abuse, mental abuse. There is also a lot of malnutrition because they even experimented on kids in these schools to where they wanted to see what would happen if they withheld certain amount of nutrition from them, and they studied that. And so there's actually children who are being malnourished in these schools. So there are just really poor conditions. And so just imagine, before you came to these schools, in our tribal communities, we had very vibrant communities. We had very healthy families. And we were raising our children. We had aunties and uncles, we had clan relatives, we had elders, we had warriors, and everybody was a part of raising these children. But when they went to these schools, they weren't raised like that anymore. They didn't learn how to parent. They didn't learn how to be a good grandparent, a good parent, or a good auntie or uncle. And so they're coming back, and they're some of the things that they were used to in these schools began a cycle in our Indian families of some of these issues that Maria has found. Having weak spiritual foundations and not being able to pass on those spiritual teachings to their children. Having more punitive and abusive discipline towards children, towards their own children, and having poor school relations, having a weak ethnic identity, having unhealthy family norms, especially for children that were seriously abused. And so we can see how historical trauma impacts families today intergenerationally from studies like this. There's another study that was done that's really looking at the psychological impacts, especially for those of you that work with substance use dependence. This is a study that really looked at some of those issues with substance use, but they were really looking at what the psychological issues that tribal peoples face today. Are they connected to some of the historical traumatic events? And it is really difficult to study this area because it's hard to really distinguish between these historical events and current traumatic events that people are going through to really know like the direct linkage between if somebody is struggling with suicidality or if somebody is struggling with their mental health. Does it have to do with the historical traumatic events, or does it have to do with their current trauma of chronic poverty or abuse, domestic violence? So it's a struggle to study these, but they're attempting to. And what they've learned in this study, you can see, I'll point out the one in the middle, or the one that says daily, the column that says daily. So if you look at, they really asked respondents how often they think about these historical losses, like for example, the loss of their culture, or the loss of families from the reservation, for those that were relocated to urban communities and losing their family members through that. The loss of their traditional ways, the loss of their land and their language, how often they thought about it. So some people on a daily basis responded that they do actually think about it on a daily basis. So 10%, 27%, 25%, actually 30% when it comes to the loss from alcoholism on their people. They actually think about it 30% of the time on a daily basis. So in addition to that, they asked them, when you think about these losses, what are some of the emotional responses that you have? What are some of the psychological impacts? So you can see that folks answer, if we're talking about often, that they often feel sad or depressed when they think about these losses, that's 11%. Or if they're feeling uncomfortable around white people, one of the things we'll discuss is historic mistrust, and that's 10%. So some people actually think about these things, and it actually affects them psychologically. More studies like this have been done, and what they found is that there's really no difference between the respondents who are older or younger. So we would think that if they're older, they kind of have experienced some of these historical events more than younger people would, but there's actually no differences in their responses. And they've actually found that those that are struggling with substance use, they're experiencing some of the psychological effects more than other respondents. So similar to trauma, other types of trauma like acute, chronic, complex traumas, there's actually historical trauma responses. So when we talk about acute trauma or complex trauma, we often talk about hyperarousal or disassociation being common responses to trauma. But for historical trauma, they've also identified some responses that are common to people who are really struggling with some of these historical traumatic events. So I talked about how the boarding schools, they did that study about how they really affected those survivors and their ability to come back into the community and be healthy and productive and contributing members of the community, and to really have good, healthy relations with the people around them, including their children. But people often wonder, like how is it that, similar to like the Holocaust survivors, how is it that their descendants are really still struggling with historical trauma responses when they're not even the ones that experienced that directly? They didn't go through those internment camps directly. So these are just some areas that have really been, we're just now starting to look into. Probably the most common one is epigenetics. People will often talk about that. So, who here knows about epigenetics? So a couple of people. So it's actually pretty new, and so there's not been a lot of research done around it, but it's growing. And what they're finding is that those that experience these historical events directly, those survivors, there's actually a genetic marker that is made. It makes changes to their genes, and that gets passed on. And it's actually the genes that have to do with memory, and it actually gets passed on to their children and grandchildren and through their lineage. So it is something that has a biological impact. So they're in their research around this, they're really trying to understand how even if descendants of survivors do not engage in any kind of issues like substance use, like for myself, I told you guys that I didn't, I chose not to get involved in that purposely because of the way I was raised. But even if a tribal person does not drink or engage in some of those health risk behaviors, that those descendants are still experiencing some of the historical trauma responses. So it's not just attributed to the fact that they're engaging in more health risk behaviors, but so they're trying to understand why that is, and that's with epigenetics they're able to learn a little bit more about that. So in summary, these are all the different levels of impact that we've talked about. There's an individual level, how historical trauma impacts people on an individual basis. So as you're thinking about your clients and what they're up against and what they're facing, some of these individual impacts. And then at a family level, the family units and some of the impacts that is having, and then at a community level. So oftentimes when we talk about trauma, we really talk about it at an individual level. And I think that really does us a disservice because we begin with a person's childhood and we wonder what kinds of events happened in their childhood that has really caused and led to some of the issues that they're struggling with in adulthood. But with historical trauma, what we're understanding is that it's the soil in which these other traumas take root. So historical trauma causes some of the environmental conditions that we see in tribal communities that really leads to some of the adverse childhood experiences that people go through. And so really understanding that even before a person is born, they're impacted by trauma. And it's not to say, this image is not to say that, like I said at the beginning, that adversity equals destiny. It doesn't mean that for every single person who is a tribal person that they're going to experience an early death. That is not the case. Because hopefully in this next section, you'll understand why we're talking about trauma-informed care. Because that really is the work of trauma-informed care, is to really understand that we can heal and that this doesn't have to be the case. And so that's what we're hoping to get to. So just to kind of understand it a little bit more, imagine that you're living in a tribal community where you've lost a lot of the folks in your community who really have knowledge about traditional healing practices. Maybe there's like a couple here and there, but maybe within your own family, a lot of that knowledge is lost. So it's not being passed down to you, or it's harder to access. Those resources that were used for millennia to really help tribal peoples who were going through difficult times is actually, access to that was actually severed or limited. And then imagine that a person in that kind of a community, growing up in that kind of community, is now dealing with current day traumas, whatever they may be. It might be grief, the loss of a loved one. It might be being in a domestic violence situation. Whatever it is that that person experiences today is not something that they experience in a vacuum. They're experiencing it within these conditions in which they have limited resources to cope in more healthy ways. And so what we find is a lot of our people are coping in maladaptive ways, and that's that's understandable, right? You're trying to survive, you're trying to cope, you're trying to deal with what it is that life, the hand that you've been dealt, and the experiences that you've had, and you're trying to find a way to get through it. And so because of that, we're seeing, just from the research that we've done so far in tribal communities, that there's high rates of adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. There's also high rates of this trauma that individuals experience over their lifetime, not just their childhood. So I'm going to introduce you guys to Reggie. And hopefully you guys can share a little bit more. I've been doing a lot of talking, so maybe you guys could share your voices in the room. But we're going to go ahead and read the story about Reggie, and then we're going to think about these two questions. What signs of historical trauma do you see in Reggie's story? And how might these traumas be influencing Reggie's life? So I'll go ahead and let you guys read. This is part 2. All right. You guys have any thoughts? What signs are there in his story that he's been through some historical trauma?
That he wasn't caring for his own daughter.
He couldn't use his own words.
He
couldn't use his own words, so he wasn't allowed to use his own words.
Oh. He lost his language? Yeah.
Maybe he just I don't know if it wasn't that he couldn't use his own language, but the way that he expressed himself, he couldn't do that.
He couldn't do any of that because he didn't have parents growing up. He was separated from them.
Yeah, he was disconnected from relationships.
Anybody else?
Grief. His grandfather died when he was away, and his mother. Grief.
Yeah. And maybe some unresolved grief from having to be away when that happened.
Or he even knew.
Do you guys know this much about your clients when you work with them? Some of you? Does it remind you of any people that you work with?
Yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me of people that I know too. So I'm gonna get you guys to pair up with one another. Since we're in a tight quarter, tight space, you're gonna pair up. So just turn. And I'm gonna give you guys a chance to discuss your own situation. And if you look at the image of this iceberg, what are some of the behaviors of the clients that you work with? They're probably coming to you because of their behaviors, right? What are some of those behaviors? That is obvious to you because that's why they're there, that we see. And then think about if any of your clients come from Montana tribes, what do you know about any of the historical trauma experiences that have happened, that Montana tribes have been through. And then I'm challenging you to see how that connects. Can you guys see the connection between the behaviors that we see in your clients and the history, the tribal history? So go ahead and have some conversation. Is there anybody that had any aha moment that they want to share? Anyone?
I'll say that my aha moment was that I don't know what Montana tribes had experienced.
Yeah, that's not uncommon.
So I can't, I think it's hard to make that correlation of what is intergenerational trauma we don't know.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because I think that is the challenge, right? When we don't know, we can't understand their experience. And if we don't understand their experience, how can we provide effective services? Anybody else have an aha moment? In the back? You're being volunteered.
We talked about a lot, but you know, we're from the same team though. But we had you know, one of the things that we had, I don't know, we really didn't know how to approach this was when we send people to treatment and they get into groups where they feel safe that they can share their experiences. We had a lot of clients come back that were male that talked about their trauma of being sexually abused by other men in their family, where we had no knowledge of that prior to that, but they came and told us openly with other people in there, and they wanted to share that experience, but then it helped with their healing, right? But there was a lot, like we were so surprised, like, what do we do about this?
I think that we're barely starting to talk about that in tribal communities, is the rate of sexual abuse. And a lot of that really started from the boarding schools. You know, I don't think it's a secret to anybody, even here in Montana. Some of the entities, the religious entities that really played a hand in taking care of these children in these schools, and how these children were hurt at the hands of those very people who were supposed to have been taking care of them. So that's complex trauma, right? You're not just being harmed by the system that's supposed to be there to care for you, but you're being harmed by people that you're supposed to be able to trust with your spiritual care, your education. I think that one of the things that you might find is people expose their traumas to you, and oftentimes you don't know how to respond. One of the things that we're learning is that when people learn to tell their story, especially when they receive trauma treatment, part of that treatment is that they actually work on their trauma narrative, really unpacking that traumatic experience and being able to talk about it and tell their story. And so when they start to do that, then they start to share that with others. But part of the reason that sexual abuse is so traumatic is because it's done in secret, right? And I think in a lot of our communities, we keep it a secret and we don't want to talk about it. So I think it's a good thing that they're coming back and they're telling you about it. They're talking about it because it might embolden somebody else who's been through something similar to also let go of the shame, because they've had to keep it a secret and protect. They've had to, they're afraid of what will happen when they say it. Yeah, in the back.
I'm a prosecutor on the Cheyenne Reservation, and the police have to ask every person they arrest now that question. It's part of their protocol. Have you ever been sexually abused? And I am amazed at, because I didn't read every police report, I am amazed at probably half of the people say they have been. And I'm also in a drug court, so I mean, how do you bring this out? When we have a person that comes into the drug court, is it my job, as one of the committee members, to say, this is what I saw in the police report, this is one of the issues here? Is that my job? I mean, but it's way bigger than I ever dreamt of, you know?
So, I think that's a really good question. What is your job? What is your role in all of this? When someone divulges something like that, the fact that they even admitted that and put that down, or that they even told you.
I think my job is to tell the rest of the committee, because we're supposed to have these little meetings before we do it. We're supposed to talk about it, about who's coming up for review, and if we know any particulars, we can help the discussion. And I think it's one of my duties to probably disclose that this is something I know. I think at least I know.
And I think it's also, if you're developing a treatment plan, you know, sometimes we do send them to treatment. You know, sometimes that helps, and sometimes it doesn't. But if we know that the root cause is actually trauma like sexual abuse, then does that inform the kind of treatment that we send them to? Are we gonna send them to treatment for substance use, or are we gonna send them to treatment for sexual abuse?
Well, that's what I'm thinking. If our drug court is supposed to try to get the correct remedy, maybe that's where we ought to be going with those, a lot of them, you know?
It needs to be both though. It needs to be both.
Right, right.
The truth is, someone who's worked as a psychiatrist, you know, there's treatment for substance abuse. There is no residential treatment for PTSD or complex trauma. And the truth is that if you go and you interview, you say, you just ask the question and you get the answer, then okay, and then how's this, I mean, you know, if you just ask for someone to divulge it without giving them a safe place to process it and make sense out of it, you know, and I would be very careful about telling other people on my team if my client didn't know I was going to be telling other people on my team, because then that's just another betrayal if I'm not careful.
That's the segue to asking why, are they getting pulled over for a ticket, or they're just asking? It seems like a weird.
Like the screen, the level of screening.
Screening, yeah, it just seems like a different set of screening questions.
Is it when they're placed in jail or by the officers?
Officers.
Because we do when they're placed in jail for safety and
Yeah, that
those
was
kind of things.
At an incarceration level, it seems like one thing.
And I don't know if it's for record keeping purposes or what. Sometimes these questions start appearing on reports and I don't know what's generating questions, but they're always on there lately on my reports. So, you know, I don't know.
In the back?
Well, I'm not a clinician, so you know, like you said, there's no residential treatment for trauma or, you know, sexual abuse. So are there things that are working? I mean, that's what I came here for, like, what can we do? I'm a goal-oriented person. I want to have something to bring back to say, here's some steps we can take to make our court more trauma informed, to have something to do, to have something to offer.
There is trauma treatment, but I think the challenge that we have, and you guys might be able to tell me this better, in our tribal communities, those trauma treatment services are few and far between. If you have mental health professionals in your tribal community, or wherever you're referring your clients to, those mental health professionals can be trained in trauma treatments and provide trauma treatment. Like I was talking about earlier, like when survivors of trauma do go through treatment, part of that treatment is to develop their trauma narrative, and that's part of the cognitive behavioral therapy model. And so there is training for cognitive behavioral therapy for the mental health professionals in your community or wherever it is that you're referring your clients to. So there is a solution. It's just, it sounds like the infrastructure is not really there. Do you have mental health professionals trained who can meet with these clients who are trained in providing trauma treatments? And then, if you do, is there a referral process for that? And one of the challenges that we have in schools, this is talking about students that have high rates of, some of our tribal schools where students have high rates of PTSD, and the same issue is coming up. We can screen them for PTSD, but we don't have enough services, enough resources to refer that child to. And so that's why we've developed some like school-based trauma treatments that can be done in the school rather than outsourcing to others, referring to other places. Can you have a mental health professional on staff who's trained in CBT? You know, have you identified people in your community or across the state who have that type of specific training that they can be sent to? And I'm specifically thinking about tribal community, tribal people who have this training.
I have a question over.
Oh, I have an answer. We have a gal, if we know that they are trauma exposed, they will be, depending on the severity of the trauma, sometimes they will start seeking safety before they even go into IOP. And so they get coping skills, and then we'll continue on with mental health and get them connected with, you know, someone who specializes in whatever their trauma was.
So I think you guys were getting to the very, in my background, my school background, we call this Tier 3 services, where we're thinking about individualized case management. But for those of you who are not in that position to really connect individuals to that level of intense care, what you can do is provide trauma-informed care. And part of that is being able to look at your environment and think about how safe your environment is, how safe your policies and procedures are, not just in your view of safety. Maybe we just think about physical safety, like you were mentioning, you screen to make sure you think about the safety of others. But thinking about that client's psychological safety within whatever care that they are in, from the time that they enter your system till the time that they exit. What kind of care are they receiving that is trauma-informed? So I can talk about all the service level impacts of historical trauma, but what historical trauma-informed care is really changing your perspectives. If you are going to provide trauma-informed care or historical trauma-informed care, you're going to change your perspective so that when you look at your clients, you don't think about what's wrong with them, you think about what happened. When they come in with a very long rap sheet, or they come in and they are repeated offenders, you don't look at that and make a judgment on their character. You think about what happened to them. What kind of supports are they lacking? What kind of resources are they lacking? And then really looking at acknowledging the fact that this is a real huge gap in our service systems. We're already kind of recognizing that right now. That trauma is at the root of a lot of the issues that we're dealing with in our service systems, but we don't have the infrastructure to provide the care that people need. So that's recognizing the how trauma is widespread, historical trauma is widespread, realizing that, and recognizing what those signs and symptoms are, because not everyone is going to divulge to you, and maybe you don't need to know. And then being able to respond through your practices and your policies and procedure in a way that you have that historical trauma lens. And then trying to figure out within your system of care, within your sphere of influence, how do you not re-traumatize someone? Someone that may or may not have a history of sexual abuse, that may or may not have a history of some other type of trauma that they've been through, neglect maybe. So it's really looking at the unique opportunity that you guys have. And I think a lot of other service systems are trying to prevent people from ending up in your court and on your caseload. That's a lot of the work that I was trying to do with students, was really prevent them from actually going down that road where they did need to end up in a juvenile detention center, or they did need to end up in adult court of some kind. But the unique opportunity that you guys have, when all of those other preventative measures have not been successful, for that third tier when people arrive in your care, how are you going to make sure you provide the best care knowing the impact that historical trauma has on them? And it's really, we really jump to pathologizing our clients, and that's understandable because we know that some of our clients really do need that. But beyond just what can I do, what can a clinician do, there's something that every one of us in this room can do. So we have to find ways that we can respond that is depathologizing historical trauma. We're not just putting another label on tribal people as something is wrong with them. And shifting the narrative to strength-based and addressing the fact that people have different levels of understanding about historical trauma. Not everybody understands that. Even the people who are directly impacted by it may not recognize that that's what their experience is about. And it's not our job to act like we know better than them and to tell them what their experience is. So really knowing how to respond to people who do not know that the impact that historical trauma has had on their life. Knowing that people have different views. Some people feel like historical trauma, it has nothing to do with them. They don't want anything to do with that. You know, they want to keep it in the past. They don't want to be pathologized. And it's really using that historical trauma lens when you look at the behaviors, when you look at the diseases that people have, how do you see them? When you look at the community or the family that they come from, how do you view them? Because our perception of them affects how we provide treatment and services. We may think that we provide everybody the same care and treatment and services, but data tells us that's not true. Data tells us that tribal peoples get different treatment and different services. So being able to understand our individual roles in that we have a responsibility to have historical trauma lens when we provide services. And recognizing that not everybody is carrying that burden. This is less researched, of course, because we always focus on the negative, but there's actually so much of our tribal peoples that there's so many strengths and so many assets that our tribal peoples have. And we often talk about it as indigenous resilience, knowing that even in the face of all of these experiences, people have learned to bounce back, they've learned to, they have things that really buffer them against those experiences. So for your clients, what kind of role can you play to help build their resilience so that we know that we can, we might not have a hand in some of the historical trauma that they're going through, but we can help them build resilience to buffer them against those experiences. And in the time that they're in your care, what can you do to build up their resilience? And it could be teaching coping skills. So recognizing that resilience is not a characteristic, and that people can be more resilient at one time in their life than another. So even if a person comes into your care and you look at their history and you see that you see very little evidence of resilience, it doesn't mean that it's not possible for them to build that up. Or even you have somebody that comes into your care and you wonder why they're even there in the first place, because they seem to be doing so well in their life and now they're involved in your system. We can all struggle with our resilience at one time or another. This is important because especially if we're talking about historical trauma, the ethnocidal and genocidal intent, what can your services do to really heal that loss that people have experienced? Some of the cultural losses, the spiritual losses that people have, is there ways for them to be reconnected? Is there ways that your system can help them reconnect to that? And I know that tribal courts and different types of courts are doing that across the country. I work with tribal healing to wellness courts and provide trauma-informed care to them. And I know that they're doing a lot of things to really connect people to their cultural identity to help build that resilience for them, because it's seen as one of the most powerful protective factors. And then this one I'll leave you because I know you guys want to know what can I do. If you haven't already, I would encourage you to look into asset framing, because if you are always thinking about your clients, especially your tribal clients, as like, these are my historical trauma clients, these are my trauma clients, you know, these are the clients that always have a hard time, that always are messed up. If we're thinking about it in that sense, we're not going to help them. So asset framing is really an intentionality. It's a skill that we learn because it's not something that we're actually born good at. It's a skill that we learn that really defines people by their aspirations and their contributions. That even those offenders that come before you repeatedly, they also have aspirations. They also have contributions. And really leading into some of those strengths that they have and working with that when you're providing treatment plans and you're providing services to them. So I know we've run out of time, so I just want to end there and just thank you guys for being a part of this session. Feel free to reach out to me if you guys have any other questions.